Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Plan Eat Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld, and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Today's episode features Dr. Andrew Smith, Chief Operating Officer at the Rodale Institute. Dr. Andrew Smith oversees the research and farm operations at Rodale Institute and is passionate about growing the organic movement by providing science-based solutions to farmers and facilitating opportunities to expand the number of organic farmers and farmland across the globe. He has over 20 years of experience working in the organic industry as an agronomist, researcher, and farmer. While trained as an entomologist, his motive for entering the organic industry was to reduce the use of chemicals for food production that end up in our environment, food, and bodies. Thank you so much for being here today, Drew.
Thanks, Rosemary. Great to be here.
Great. So let's start off. Could you tell me a little bit about the Rodale Institute and the work that it does?
Sure. A lot of people were familiar with the Rodale Institute through Organic Gardening and Farming magazine. We get a lot of people that come and tell us they used to get that magazine. They also publish Prevention magazine and a lot of other titles that people would recognize. But it really started with J.I. Rodale in the 1940s. He wasn't a farmer. He was an industrialist. Him and his brother manufactured switches. Their company that they started still exists today here in the Lehigh Valley in Pennsylvania, Lutron Technologies. But he bought a farm in the region, didn't know how to farm, started asking questions about farming. This was in the 1940s, coming out of, coming right out of World War II. And he was told, well, here's what you need to be a successful farmer. This is the fertilizer that you need to use. These are the chemicals you need to control insects and pests. And it just didn't jive with his thinking. He looked and said, okay, well, these fertilizers, we use those to make bombs. And these insecticides we use for tear gas. And I don't really understand how I can take these products, put them in the soil, and the result is a healthy food for my family to eat. Because he wasn't relying on farming as his source of income. He was looking at it more from a health perspective. And so it sent him on this exploration journey of how the connection between soil health, healthy plants, and ultimately human health. And I think he really, at the time, saw where agriculture was headed. Even probably people told him the idea is not for you to produce healthy people, is to produce as much as possible as we can of food, which also didn't jive with him. He thought it wasn't the whole purpose of food is to make people healthy and to sustain life. And that wasn't really necessarily the mindset, because it was more of a business industrial mindset. So that sent him on this exploration. He ultimately realized that he needed research and science to make some of the claims that he was making. His son, Bob Rodale, really took that Organic Gardening and Prevention magazine to a new level. And they had a very successful press as well for a very long time, until recently that they sold the press. But he took that same kind of business mindset to research. When he went to the USDA and said, we need an organic program, they said, we don't have any data, we don't have any research. This would have been in the 1970s and 1980s. And so he said, okay, well, we need to add more, serious research. It can't just be backyard gardening. It has to be tailored to larger scale farming. If we want farmers to take us serious, farmers to adopt this, and policymakers to create an organic program. And that ultimately came to fruition in around 2000, where the USDA did create a recognized organic program. And until that existed, there was really no mechanism for the federal government to invest in organic farming. Now there's organic research programs. More recently, we have a transition to organic program that actually helps farmers make that transition to organic. So a lot of all this that we're now seeing really in the last couple of years started in the 1940s with J.I. Rodale.
Why is transitioning to organic agriculture critical?
Well, that's really our mission at Rodale Institute, is to facilitate more farmers transitioning to organic, because we see that it touches so many areas of society. Probably the one we think is most important is that organic farmers are more profitable. We look around and farmers are struggling to be profitable, largely because the revenue that they can generate from low prices, crop prices, the crop prices really aren't enough to support the costs. If you look at historic crop prices, they've stayed almost exactly the same over a long period of time, 20, 30, 40 years, while costs continue to go up. I mean, nobody expects to pay for the same amount of gas that they did back in 1970. So farmers' costs have continued to go up while mostly commodity prices have not gone up. So that's the profitability is important for farmers. We have a lot of data both on our research and research around the world that shows that organic farmers are more profitable. It's most of the production is more natural. So we're increasing organic matter in the soil. We had a lot of data that showed that back in the 1970s, 1980s, that these methods, what we call green manures, so these is using plants as forms of fertility, using compost as forms of fertility, that this increased organic matter or carbon in the soil. Well, now we're talking about climate change. And so there's a strong benefit of transitioning to organic to what we call soil carbon sequestration, or drawing down carbon from the atmosphere, putting that into the soil. All soil scientists will agree that there's the soil performs better when we have more carbon in the soil. It holds on to moisture, it holds on to nutrients. There's almost a straight line positive correlation between organic matter and carbon in the soil and crop yields. So there's a strong benefit to the planet to putting more carbon in the soil, but there's also a real strong benefit to farmers. And as we see that we have periods of drought and periods of high rainfall that are more sporadic, we might call that climate uncertainty. These systems are also more resilient. They have tremendous higher water holding capacity, and therefore during periods of drought, they can be more productive. And we've seen that and we have a couple long-term research trials. So it's not just 3 years of data, we now have 43 years of data. And we can look at periods of drought, and every time there's periods of drought or low rainfall, we have significantly higher yields in our organic plots compared to our conventionally managed plots. And then, of course, probably the biggest reason that we've started this before climate change was chemical contamination. We made some real inroads in the 70s and 80s with reducing chemicals, but unfortunately around 2006, we've seen a real inflection point where there's been an increase in chemical use in agriculture. We're starting to see wells contaminated with nitrogen, and that's significant impacts on our human health as we're drinking that. And that's nitrogen, that's fertilizer for crops. But organic sources of fertilizer are not water soluble, so they tend not to leach into wells. They're not evaporating as nitrous oxide, so there's less chance of loss of those products into the environment. And then we're seeing increases in insecticides and herbicides that are also environmental pollutants and could have a major impact on human health.
You touched upon some of the research that you do at Rodale. Could you tell me a little bit more about what the farming systems trial is and some of its key findings?
Sure. So the farming systems trial started in 1981, and that really came on the heels of a USDA report that was published in 1980 that demonstrated they had gone around the country looking at farms that were farming naturally, what we would now call organically, and they said, "Oh my gosh, you know what? There's a lot of farms here that have practicing these methods, and some of them are 300 acres, 1,000 acres, 3,000 acres. It's not just backyard gardeners." But we currently have no research on how they compare to the more traditional or current conventional methods. So in 1981, Bob Rodale started the Farming Systems Trial. It's a side-by-side comparison of organic and conventional grain crop production. It's now, I think it's 43, 44 years. We have a conventional method, which is the chemical, we would call a chemical method. But this is what the standard recommendations to farmers are. So we have consultants, in our case, because we're located in Pennsylvania, from Penn State University, weed scientists and soil scientists, and it's the same recommendations they would be making to farmers growing corn and soybeans in the state. And then we have an organic legume. It's a low input system. This system has never had any fertilizer fertility in the history of the system. So it's relying only on plants, leguminous plants like clovers and alfalfa for sources of fertility. No compost even. And then what we call our manure system is really similar to maybe a dairy farm or a farm that is recycling that manure back as compost. And it's growing some forages like alfalfa that also have a fertility benefit, but also are needed for livestock forage. And probably some of the key findings are that I should probably say a couple of things is in 2008, we included a no-till system because we saw that no-till was rising in the country. In Pennsylvania, we have close to 70% of our grain crop farmers are practicing no-till. Most of that, though, is a conventional system that's using herbicides, so increase in herbicides, and now GMO crops. So prior to the introduction of this, if you didn't have GMO crops, you could spray herbicides like Roundup just before planting, but then at many times that would be gone and weeds would come up, and we were actually able to out yield a typical no-till system in an organic system in some of our early trials. But now that you can spray, some cases 3-4 times over top of a growing crop, there's much more effective weed management in a conventional system. But like I said, that's also resulted in a substantial increase in herbicide use across the country as a result. So we have no-till, and then in the organic systems, it's not a complete continuous no-till system, but it is a cover crop based system where we grow cover crops, and we grow those crops, or we call them cover crops because they're not intended to be harvested and sold and eaten. They're really growing them to produce plant biomass, and then gets rolled down or terminated and creates a weed suppressing mulch. And we have the technology now to plant the crops right into that mulch and soil, and one pass through the field. We don't have to make multiple passes. So there's a benefit for reducing tillage to the health of the soil, reducing soil erosion. And there's even greater benefit to soil health by keeping it covered with plants. We had a torrential rain here yesterday. I'm assuming where you are, you probably got something similar. Well, if all that soil has nothing living and growing or covering it, it's prone to loss. And so we've added that in the system in 2008. And a lot of our more recent publications have looked at the 2008 to 2020, so about a 12-year accumulation of data to look at I think for the first time, a side-by-side comparison of a conventional no-till system and an organic no-till system. There's certainly been data that's compared a conventional till versus no-till, And we had a few trials, and a few other universities like Iowa State and University of Wisconsin had some trials comparing an organic tilled system versus an organic no-till system. So you can imagine some of the benefits of the reduced till, no-till system are we're going over that field one time planting. We are confident that we can get yields organic in the organic system that are comparable to a conventional system. But it requires fertility inputs like compost. And we sometimes make 9 or 10 trips over the field for weed management. So we're burning fuel when we do that, and we're disturbing the soil when we do that. So we're looking for and developing systems that are more effective, efficient, and regenerative. So that's one of the methods we're working on. But we now have, in some highlights in the last 12 years are that probably the worst soil health that we have is the continuous conventional no-till. And that doesn't make any sense to soil scientists, because they've been in their mostly conventional field where they had tillage versus no-till, and almost always the no-till has an improvement. But what we're finding, and you can find other results in literature for this, is that the cover crops, or like what I call it, green manure, and the use of those, which you have to use in organic because you can't just go buy fertilizer and be effective. So you have to manage your system such that you're using plants and compost to get a sufficient fertility. And that's resulting in not only increased organic matter and carbon in the soil, but if we look at a whole host of soil health indicators, those are what's driving improved soil health. And when we look at just no-till with no cover crops or no cover on the soil, you're not getting that, there aren't roots to get the nutrients and the carbon down into the soil. Even tillage can effectively add some of that biomass down deeper into the soil where microbes can feed on it. And so we're continuing to march down and doing research trying to reduce tillage, because we do think there's a real benefit to reducing tillage. But we see that it's not just reducing tillage is not the answer to improving soil health. It's a combination of multiple factors that most organic farms are adopting. They need to adopt in order to be successful.
So what is the vegetable systems trial, and what are some of those key findings?
Right, so the vegetable systems trial is similar to the farming systems trial, and then it's a side-by-side comparison of organic and conventionally grown vegetables. But we realized probably around 2003 or so, when many reports came out showing data that the nutritional quality, the concentration of nutrients in our food has declined. And we started thinking to ourselves, was that because the soil has degraded? And we had pretty good reports that show that soil has degraded over this last 70 years or so. And maybe it's because the nutrients aren't in the soil anymore, they're lower, there's also microorganisms that are involved with antioxidants and bioactive compounds and proteins and vitamins. It isn't just like there aren't vitamins in the soil. The plant has to make those vitamins with the nutrients they have. So we wanted to test that. There wasn't really good data. And we also understood that if we're trying to make the link from soil health to human health, that link between, hey, I eat a tomato or eat potatoes or lettuce makes a little more sense than, well, this grain was produced to feed chickens, and then are the chickens healthy, or how are they produced? So there's a little closer link to human health. But it is a research trial similar to the farming systems trial. But we also look at it as an initiative where we want to not only look at the nutritional quality or nutritional density of food, but we want to engage with scientists more in the medical field and doctors, and start to understand these links between soil health, how we grow food, and ultimately human health. So we've already started testing grains in the farming systems trial, the nutritional quality of grains in the farming systems trial, knowing that our expectation is that we're starting in the vegetable systems trial with the same soil, same baseline soil, that it'll take time for those changes to occur in the soil that will result in changes in nutritional quality. But some of the early findings in the vegetable systems trial, one which we kind of expected was that the soil organic matter or soil carbon has increased in the organic system, but decreased in the conventional system. And, that organic matter, that carbon, that's food for microbes. So we really expect that that's going to start to translate into differences in nutrition over time. It looks like there's a couple minerals that could be starting to be different in higher in the organic and lower in the conventional. So we think that it's going to take a longer period of time. So just doing a 2 or 3 year study, and some of the previous work that compared organic and conventional nutritional quality sometimes were just a 2 or 3 year study, and they didn't take into account the long-term changes in the soil that might occur. But we expect that probably one of the biggest findings is going to be differences in bioactive compounds or antioxidants in the organic foods.
I know that animals can play a really important role in organic agriculture. So what are some of the environmental and climate benefits of raising livestock on pasture rather than in confined animal feeding operations or CAFOs?
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly the organic, there's a benefit if you look at organic, and if you were to look, let's say, the nutritional quality of the few studies that have looked at meat and milk have shown increased nutritional quality in organic. And that's mostly due to the fact that there's a requirement to be on pasture for livestock in the organic system. If you look at a complete grass bed, so there's some cases where you have an organic that has a part of the life of the animals out on pasture, or has access to outdoors, where the complete life of the animal is out on outdoors. Those are even healthier. So we think that there's a health benefit to humans of eating products that are out in nature, out grazing. They're practicing their inherent character traits. But I think a lot of this was anecdotal or intuitive to organic farmers, especially early on. They could just see that, well, they needed a fertility method. They had a farm that was in balance when they had some livestock on that farm to be able to recycle nutrients back to the farm. In many cases, farms sometimes just had a few livestock because they were producing their own milk and for their own family, or just a few animals for themselves. But we really saw in the United States from about 1980 to early 2000s, this divorce of livestock and this specialization where you had crop farmers over here and livestock farmers over there. So, CAFOs, or concentrated animal feed operations, aren't allowed in organic. They wouldn't meet the rule of access to pasture and how the portion of their life that are, have access to pasture or management. The Rodale Institute is actually trying to take a step forward even more than the organic label with a regenerative organic certification. So we've been part of creating the Regenerative Organic Alliance, which has a regenerative organic certification where livestock, in addition to just following the organic practices, they'd have to be certified humane or in a animal welfare certification. And that's because I think a lot of early organic farmers see the benefit of managing livestock properly to improve the health and the soil. And there's some more recent data that's looked more at rangeland and is showing this potential high carbon sequestration potential, which means they could draw down carbon and store it in soils, which is the rationale for why we even have these deep carbon soils in the Great Plains, these areas where you had buffalo and large hoof stock grazing over large periods, and the impact that they had resulted in accumulation of carbon in the soil over time, which is why those are some of the most fertile soils in the country and the world. But it also gets to the ethos of early organic farmers and organic farmers in general, is that they thought of it much more than just a food production system. It was about treating animals properly. It was about treating people properly. So that certification also has a social fairness component. And it was, of course, it was about treating the environment fairly. And we think you can't separate those things. I mean, you can't abuse the environment and think that you're treating people fairly, because people live in the environment, people rely on the environment. We talk about ecosystem services. We want to produce healthy food. You can't treat people poorly and say, well, we would say you really shouldn't even be called an organic farmer if you're treating your people poorly or your animals poorly. So it should all go together as a holistic system.
Thinking more about the holistic system, how can livestock be integrated into cropping systems to improve soil health? And what does that look like in practice?
So if you look at a standard dairy farm, and it's easy for me because I can look out my window and I see one, and I look out the other window, I see another, and I drive by many where I'm situated. Not everybody has that opportunity or have worked in agriculture to understand how dairy farm is managed. You can kind of see that it works. I mean, they grow forages like alfalfa. Research studies have shown that alfalfa grown for 4 or 5 years, is what most dairy farms are growing to feed their cows, actually provides nitrogen fertility for 4 years afterwards. So you're growing and you're building your fertility. Then you might graze those livestock on the alfalfa or other pasture, and they're recycling. The animals take about 20% off that pasture, and they deposit 80% back, and recycle those nutrients. And then that area can then be grown to grow crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, oats. Some cases fed back to the animals. In some cases, it enters our food stream. I think other ways that we're really looking at it too is how can we use what we call silvopasture. So silvoculture is growing trees, and pasture is grazing animals. Especially if we're thinking about health and growing healthy products, can we grow nuts and things of that nature, while at the same time managing the weeds and managing the understory of those crops for an additional product. In many cases, it also gets back to the humane treatment of the animals, because it provides shade for the animals. Sometimes the forage will grow better during hot periods under a tree and under shade. So there's a lot of connections there. There's a lot of demonstrated benefits of agroforestry and silvopasture, but the adoption has been slow. We actually hired a perennial plant scientist about a year ago. We did that because we had orchard land that had part of organic orchard research, and we started asking the question: we would love to see more apple production and more people eating apples, and there's health reasons for that. But producing them organically is difficult, especially in the eastern United States. We get heavy rainfalls and you have high fungal pressure. You'll see more in Washington State and out west, where they have lower rainfall. They have reliable irrigation sources. It's a little easier, and therefore it's expanding there, but not necessarily here. But so we asked the question, maybe we don't need to be growing apples. They're not native to Pennsylvania, but there's a lot of crops that are native to eastern and northeastern United States that are edible. So part of our program there includes hazelnuts, chestnuts, even some things like elderberry, mulberry that might be native. And we might even be asking the question, okay, if we were to put pigs, let's say, could they eat the mulberries that fall on the ground? They're actually in our orchard now that to eat our dropped apples. And we're asking the question, let's look at the economics. Can we reduce the grain that we're feeding to the pigs? Could that make up for the loss of or lack of production in the apple orchard by when we reduce sprays? Because even the organic apple system that we had was still heavily spray intensive. So it costs a lot of money, spend a lot of time, and even though they might be organic chemicals, they're getting into the environment.
So what can people do to help our current agriculture system transition to one that's more sustainable and focused on organic agriculture?
Right. Great question. I'd probably start with buying local. There's tremendous benefits to supporting your local farm. Well, if you look at the nutrition quality aspect, one of the biggest reasons that we have reduced nutrient concentrations in our crops is because we bred them for higher yields or to be shipped across the country or across the world. So they're harvesting tomatoes green and hard as a rock and perfectly round. If they're not perfectly round, they get discarded. And then they get shipped from California and Florida to wherever they need to go. And then they gas them so they turn red. And those varieties don't really have high nutritional quality. And there is a benefit to ripening on the vine for some nutrients to enter into the tomatoes. Just using tomatoes as an example. But if you go to a farmer's market or you buy locally from your farm, they're probably growing things that taste good. And they might not sit on your shelf as long. They might not be able to sit in the grocery store that long, but they have higher nutritional value. And that money is then going into the local economy. We think of the same thing for healthcare. When people say, I couldn't possibly buy organic because it costs too much, then they go to that same store and they pick up their prescription medicines and usually spending hundreds of dollars a month, where if they would just eat right and change their lifestyle, they would actually not need that money, and they could easily put that into their food costs. So, and we actually, if you follow a more healthy eating pattern, you actually tend to reduce your costs, honestly. So I'm getting to my second one, which would be to buy organic. And so we think organic's healthier. We certainly know we have data to show that the pesticide residues are either zero or much less on organic products. So that's a health benefit. The vegetable systems trial is trying to answer that question of, are they healthier for you from a standpoint of vitamins, minerals, antioxidants? But then you're supporting farmers that are caring for the environment, that have made a commitment to organic and management in a certain way. So I think there's a lot of benefits that people may not see to purchasing organic products. So those are I think some of the two biggest recommendations I would make.
Do you have any other kind of final thoughts or things you'd like to share?
The loss of biodiversity on the farm is really can hamper keeping farms in ecological balance, if that makes sense. In order to be honestly economically viable, farms have gotten bigger. They've removed hedgerows, they've removed natural areas. In some cases, we're growing crops on places really shouldn't be growing crops. But because we have chemicals, we can make it work. And or some farms, they're like, well, every 3 years I'll get something out of that spot. But if we could put that back into natural habitat, natural area, even from a landscape view, not just a farmscape view, it shows to be beneficial. I've looked at some studies that showed that just simply by farming in a more diverse area, and we're talking about, an entire region, not a single farm, there's no the pest prevalence is very low, and actually adding natural remedies doesn't really result in any increased benefit. But if you look at an area that is extremely monoculture, is extremely replete of diversity, then adding natural enemies or adding some sort of natural control actually has a really high benefit. And that's where then you probably say, well, then I need to have chemicals to control these insects. So there's a real strong benefit of diversification within the landscape. And I actually say that what you tend to see, this is completely anecdotal, what you tend to see is when an organic farmer becomes financially successful, they say, I no longer am going to grow on my poor land or my marginal land or my wet land. So I'm going to let that go, or I'm going to plant some pollinator habitat, or I'm going to put some trees in, and then all of a sudden their pest populations start declining. And then they don't know whether it was because of that, but they suddenly realize that something they did is getting things back into balance.
That's cool. I like that. That's a great theme to kind of end with, is the theme of balance and how that can contribute to biodiversity. So thank you so much for joining today, Drew. It's been awesome hearing from you. And yeah, all the best to you and the Rodale Institute.
Great. Thanks, Rosemary. Good luck, Rosemary. Good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the week.
All right, you too. I'll talk to you later.